right, hi everybody. This lecture is going to dig into the concept of field experiments, which is a new method that differs in important ways from what we've talked about so far, lab experiments. And we're going to start thinking through why the findings of lab and field experiments are sometimes conflicting, so sometimes arriving at different conclusions about what causality does or doesn't look like in the context of media effects. So let's first kind of recap where we've been so far this semester with randomized lab experiments. What we've seen as we've gone through and looked at some of these lab experiment examples is that lab experiments are really powerful because when designed well, they can allow for lots of clear control over the independent variable. We have really high control over measurement, so what is the outcome we're interested in and how are we going to capture that in the study. And it's also going to allow us to ensure random assignment, that each individual that comes into our study has an equal chance of being in the treatment or control groups. And so we have a lot of really well-controlled ability. We have a strong ability to control each of these features of the experiment because we have participants coming up, rocking up to our lab, and we are basically designing the whole experience for them, keeping things really consistent across participants, and then just seeing how behavior changes based on these kind of different features we're manipulating across different groups of people. The limitation, of course, is that when participants are coming to participate in a study like this, is that they're really aware that they're being studied. And depending on the design of the study and the context and the topic, this might matter more or less. We've already talked about, demand characteristics when people, guess the purpose of a study. But no matter what you do, people are coming in and they know they're being observed by a researcher. They know the researcher is assessing something about them. And that could be a problem. It's very unlike how you are in your everyday life where, nobody's watching you do, like when you're watching a TV show or playing a video game, usually somebody isn't hovering over you, kind of watching what you're doing. So just the sheer fact of being in an experiment really changes the nature of the experience relative to these experiences as we care about them in the real world. They're also artificial because we're randomly assigning participants to media exposure. So it's not often, though, it will probably sometimes happen where somebody's like, I'm making you watch this thing. You don't have a choice. I'm making you play this game. You don't have a choice. I'm making you scroll this TikTok feed. You don't have a choice. Obviously, you do have a choice. You could leave the study and not participate. But there's no degree of self-selection. There's usually no kind of allowing you the option to choose which media experience you're going to have in an experiment. The purpose of that is because when we randomly assign, we can ensure group equivalence, which is helpful for increasing internal validity, but it's really weakening our external validity. It's making it unlike the media experiences that you might have in real life, where you're not self-selecting, you're actually being forced to do something. And the behavioral measures that we're collecting are often somewhat contrived or artificial or weird because we're creating situations where we want to see if you engage in this behavior that we're interested in. So we've talked about a few different measures of aggressive behavior, things like hitting the Bobo doll, things like these competitive reaction time tasks where we're blasting sound into a fictional participant's ears and so forth. These are all things that you're not usually doing in the real world. You're not usually, hitting a Bobo doll. You're very rarely ever like blasting loud music or loud sounds into somebody's ears. And so the way we try to approximate behavior in the lab can just sometimes be kind of contrived, particularly for these more complex, complicated outcomes like aggression. And so as we've noted when we've kind of talked about external validity is that these limitations make it so that the things that we're seeing in the lab may not actually occur in the real world in the way that we've studied them. So we might find that playing a violent video game increases how loud of the noise blast you give to a participant, but we may be less certain whether that's going to translate to these real world situations we care about, where you might be self-selecting to play a video game, and then seeing if you engage in real world aggression, like yelling at your partner or punching your friend or whatever it might be. So will these effects that we see in the lab in these highly controlled and often artificial settings, will they actually translate to the real world? And this is what we're thinking about when we're kind of balancing internal and external validity. Ideally, we would want studies that have really high external and internal validity. Internal validity referring to the control we have over the study, our ability to rule out these alternative explanations for a cause and effect relationship. and external validity referring to the realism of the study. How well are we capturing and reflecting the real world experiences that we care about? But there's generally going to be a trade-off. The more controlled our experiment is, often the less realistic it's going to be, because we have exerted more control over the situation in a way that makes it really unlike situations in real life. And alternatively, the more realistic a study is, the less controlled it's going to be. Because as you know, real life, it's crazy, it's chaotic. There's all kinds of things going on. There's all kinds of unexpected things that might arise, and humans are complicated people, and they make weird choices. And so the more realistic we try to make a study, we usually inherently have to let go of some of control in the way that we often do in a lab experiment. So in other words, what we're often seeing with studies is that those studies with high internal validity often come with lower external validity, and those with low internal validity often come with higher external validity. This isn't always the case. There are some contexts in studies where you can score really highly on both of these things. You really don't want a study where you score low on both of these things. Ideally, you want high on one dimension at least, and ideally trying to strengthen it on both. But ideally, we would like other kinds of methods that can speak to the weaknesses of lab experiments. So we'd like to be able to do something that can acknowledge the issues that come with lab experiments and try to see, when we look at these things in a more realistic setting, do we get similar patterns of behavior or not? And so that brings us to what we call a field experiment. And so this is just an experiment that's conducted in a natural setting rather than a laboratory. So it's not a participant coming up into my research lab on campus or wherever it might be, at the local science museum where I have one. It's going to actually occur in the real world. It's going to occur in homes, in schools, in stores, whatever it might be. It's going to be a study that we're actually kind of taking out into the real world and seeing how things happen. And the idea here, what's usually happening is that we're trading some degree of internal validity for external validity, because we're mimicking these experimental approaches in real world settings. As I said, schools, daycares, camps, workplaces, homes, online, movie theaters, wherever it might be. But because I'm relinquishing some control over the control I usually would have over the situation in the lab, I'm relinquishing that control so that I can have some better external validity, that I know that this is how these things actually unfold out in the real world. So let's think about a violent media example. I might have a lab version of a study where I bring kids into my lab and I randomly assign them to watch a violent video or a non-violent video, and then I observe their behavior in the lab afterward, maybe with a competitive reaction time sound blasting test. Again, kind of a contrived measure of aggression. A possible kind of field version of this study is that I might randomly assign children to watch violent television or non-violent television at home or at school, wherever it might be, and then I might observe their interactions at school. So I might see how they're actually engaging and interacting with other kids that they then see after they've been exposed to this kind of violent programming. So are they meaner? Are they engaging in more exclusion? Are they actually engaging in physical aggression? So the actual behaviors that you think I might care about when I talk about something like violence and aggression. So I can actually go in the field and see, do those behaviors actually manifest in the way that I might worry about? But when I take these studies out into the field, as I've noted, we're going to lose some control over all aspects of study design. And because of that, it's going to weaken our internal validity. And so we're going to talk about three key types of control that we're sort of often relinquishing in these study designs. We're losing control over how the IV is manipulated and administered. We're often losing control over how the dependent variable is assessed and measured. And then we're often also losing control over how participants are randomized to condition. We're still going to try our best to randomize them, but it's not always going to work as nicely as it does in the lab, where each individual is sort of assigned to this condition or that condition. So let's talk about each of these. First, with losing control. So in the lab, we generally know, if we have trained our research assistants well and designed the study really well, that everybody's going to come in and engage with this media stimulus in pretty much the same way. They're going to watch it on the same screen at the same volume. They're going to have the same instructions before watching. The environment's going to be identical. And so we know that each participant that's come in has really experienced something really, really similar to all the other ones in their condition. So all of those who watched a violent film experience that film in a really similar way. all those who watched a nonviolent film experience that nonviolent film in a very similar way. When we bring these studies out into the field, we can't always be as certain that media messages were experienced as we intended them. So you can imagine, and if I'm going into somebody's home and having them watch either by themselves, were they actually by themselves, or were they watching with siblings? Were they watching with family? If I'm going out into a movie theater and I'm showing it on the big screen and I have a bunch of people in the theater all at once, are those who watched it at noon kind of having the same experience as those who watched it at 4 p.m. and whatever it might be in that particular study? You can just start to imagine all of the competing factors that might be at play. Other people in the room who are talking and interjecting. Are you watching it with the sound on the screen, or are you watching it with sound on your headphones? Are you watching it with 3D glasses on or no 3D glasses on? All these other features that we can imagine in the real world that might start to come into play. And so it's going to raise additional questions that we wouldn't always have in the lab. When I have you in the lab, I can see you sitting there watching the screen for the 10 minutes that I want you to. When we're in the field, I might not be able to do that as well. So I might have questions about, did participants actually watch the entire stimulus as I intended? Were they actually paying attention the whole time that they were watching the stimulus? And really, really importantly, we might have what's called a spillover effect. And this happens when participants in our control condition or our comparison condition might also experience the treatment condition, or vice versa. So an example of this would be if I'm randomly assigning kids to watch violent television at home, are they also actually watching a lot of nonviolent TV? Conversely, if I'm assigning them to watch nonviolent TV at home, are they actually also watching violent TV either at home or at friends' houses and so forth? So I might lose control over the other media experiences that person might be having. They might not only be experiencing the one kind of media experience that I'm interested in, they might also have other ones simultaneously going on. And so this would be spillover in the sense that my treatment is also experienced by the control, and maybe my control is also experienced by the treatment. And you can imagine this might weaken the effects of either because I'm kind of getting a little bit of both. We're also going to lose control over how the dependent variable is measured. So in the lab, we're often measuring these things immediately in a standardized format. As I've mentioned, like the Bobo doll, how many times are you punching him and how are you punching him and what are you saying? The competitive reaction time tasks, how many noise blasts are you giving? How loud are those noise blasts? And so forth. But when we go into the field, we're not always going to have these really beautiful kind of setup situations. So in the example I mentioned before, if we have kids watching violent TV at home or in schools, and then we're observing their behavior on the playground, I might have to start broadening how I'm defining some of these things so that I can capture all the different ways that, for example, aggression might be manifesting. So if I'm just observing them on the playground for 10 minutes, is the behavior that I'm interested in even going to happen in that 10 minutes? I don't know. I haven't set up this situation in the way the Bobo doll or the competitive reaction time task is set up. They're just out on the playground after lunch doing their normal thing. So am I actually going to see examples of the behavior that I care about, of aggression or even kind, generous types of behaviors? And then how well can I actually ensure that I'm measuring all these participants in the same way? So if I'm observing all the kids on the playground at the same time, I might have multiple researchers observing different kids, but then I also need to try and standardize the way that all these researchers are making judgments about all of these different kids. So are we all kind of observing behaviors in a similar way and identifying the behaviors that we care about in a similar way? So it's just it doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that it's going to be trickier than what we'll see in a lab setting. And we might also then lose control over randomization. So as I noted, in the lab, individuals are coming in and we can easily randomly assign them to this condition or that condition, often with the flip of a coin or with whatever. But in the fields, we might not be able to randomly assign in that way at that level, particularly when we're thinking about studies that take places in classrooms or in schools or in daycare centers. You often can't just pick one kid out of the group and have them do some media experience while the 20 other kids are in the room doing something else. It doesn't work logistically in some of these settings. So you might imagine that what happens is we might be actually randomizing groups of people to these different experiences. So the daycare class in the morning is going to watch my violent film, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and my afternoon daycare class is going to watch the non-violent film, Toy Story. And maybe I'll counterbalance those across different days or whatever it might be. And This isn't the end of the world, but what's important to note is that there may be pre-existing differences in these groups that I need to then try to account for in my study. If you recall, randomization, the great thing about randomization is that we can sort of wash out or control for these group differences by creating group equivalents through random assignment. When I randomize groups of people, I can't always be sure that there aren't pre-existing differences in groups. Maybe there's more boys in one group, maybe there's more aggressive kids in one group. And so I'll need to do some fancier analyses to kind of try to account for the fact that I've randomized in groups rather than at the individual level. But important to note that once we have moved away from that individual level of randomization, we're going to start having questions about group equivalence or pre-existing group differences. So the nice thing about field experiments is that when we, conduct a study out in the field and we have results from that study, whether they're showing differences between groups or not, we can be pretty certain that those results are going to generalize to other examples of real-world settings because we've actually conducted the study in the real world. So the external validity is going to be kind of high, or at least higher than our lab experiments typically are. But we're going to have greater questions about internal validity. So if we do see group differences in a field study, we might be uncertain about what actually caused those differences, or are there alternative explanations that I need to try to account for to say what the causal factor was. So for example, if there are differences, what is the causal mechanism? Was the treatment condition actually administered in the way that I expected? Did all children actually pay attention to the stimulus as I expected? And so forth. So was it actually administered in the way that I hoped? Conversely, if no differences emerge, I might be worried about spillover effects. So were there actually kids in the control condition that were experiencing the treatment outside of school, or once they get home? Were they actually playing lots of violent video games at home, even if they were watching non-violent stuff at school? So how can I try to account for what these potential spillover effects that are happening? And then, again, if random assignment wasn't possible, can I actually try to rule out some of these pre-existing group differences? Can I actually try to measure some of these things and try to demonstrate somehow that the groups seem to be pretty equivalent at the start of the study? So the thing to note, in the lab, we're usually designing our lab experiments explicitly to rule out a lot of these kind of alternative explanations. But in the field, we kind of have to accept them as part of the messiness of going out into the field. So one of your assigned readings for this week is an older reading by this team, Godot and Sprafkin. And what they were doing was taking a look at the literature on media violence and aggression and really doing a deep dive on field experiments on the effects of violent media. And they were doing this because they were saying, hey, we recognize what these lab experiments have been finding, but we really want to note the value of external validity of this kind of research, and we want to see what the field experiments are saying. And they were doing a really critical deep dive into 20 field experiments that had been done up to that point. And the main takeaway that they have in that reading is that they're really not that convinced by the body of research at the time. They weren't convinced that it was really demonstrating a clear link between violent media exposure and aggression. So kind of unlike what lab experiments were often concluding at the time, they were saying field experiments seem to be pointing to a slightly different conclusion, even if they weren't always framed that way. So I want to pull one of the examples that they mention in this article. So you weren't actually assigned to read this article that I have here by Friedrich and Stein, an earlier study from 1973. But I want to walk you through what they did in this study because it's one of the examples that Godot and Sprafkin are kind of taking issue with. They're saying, hey, we read that study too. It's a really great field study. They have some interesting results. But the way the findings are interpreted and talked about don't actually seem to support the link that researchers seem to be arguing for. So I want to walk you through what happened in this study just to give you one of these kind of salient examples of a field study and how it was kind of conflicting with what other researchers that were finding in lab experiments. So just some quick background. In this study, Friedrich and Stein, they conducted a field experiment over a 9-week summer program with 97 children aged 4 to 5. And so they were going into these kind of daycare summer camp classrooms. And at week 4, they were randomly assigning children to watch a sequence of violent programs, pro-social programs, or neutral programs. So pro-social programs being programs where characters are kind of helping each other, being kind and generous. Violent programs being this more classic kind of violent aggressive. and then neutral programs being more kind of like documentary. I'll talk more about this in a second. And so after that random assignment, they were watching 12 programs over 4 weeks. So they were assigned to watch kind of this diet of violent programs, or diet of pro-social programs, or diet of neutral programs. And their free play was being observed over the course of the summer. So they had researchers going in and kind of doing standardized assessments of how kids were socially interacting with each other on the playground and in the classroom. So the interesting thing is, what programs were they actually using back in 1973? So they had the classic animated Batman program for the violence condition. They had Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for the pro-social condition. And they had these kind of like different sorts of child-focused documentaries in the neutral condition. So something that wasn't really about social behavior, more just about like, hey, learn about this farm that these kids are working on. Interestingly, they don't provide a ton of details about this condition in the article. I'm really going to emphasize the Batman versus Mr. Rogers comparison, which is the one they really dig into in the Godot and Sprafkin review of all of these kinds of field experiments. So in this study, again, children were randomized to view 12 of these different kinds of programs over the course of the summer. Before and after this intervention, the researchers were measuring kids' social behavior on the playground and in the classroom. So this was a 3x2 design. So there was 3 different types of television: violent versus pro-social versus neutral, random assignment occurring, and then time interval before exposure and versus after exposure. In other words, before the treatment and then after the treatment. And this is just an excerpt from the study that you can read in more depth if you're curious about what types of behaviors they were looking for on the playground and in the classroom. They were measuring many, many different kinds of aggressions. They had kind of different categories of aggression. I'll highlight 2 here: that physical assault included things like hitting, banging, throwing, pulling at another person or the toys that person is playing with. Nonverbal teasing being things like nonverbal aggression that doesn't involve actual physical attack, like withholding an object from another child or interfering with another play. Some other ones here you can see like name calling, jeering, threatening, angry talk. So they're trying to capture many different ways that aggression might manifest in social behavior. So you can imagine it's a bit trickier, that you're going to have to try and come up with a standardized way of assessing these things amongst many different researchers across many different days over time. So it can be more complicated to do. It is possible. And a little more interesting, I would say, than some of these lab measures that we often have, like punching the Bobo doll or doing a competitive reaction time task. In these cases, these are actual physical or real world manifestations of aggression that you can imagine being interested in. So the interesting thing about this study is what they found. And basically, across most of the different kinds of aggression they measured, there were no effects of what condition kids were assigned to. It didn't matter what program they watched, for how long they watched it, there were no effects. They did get effects on one measure of aggression, this interpersonal aggression measure. So this kind of aggression that would manifest without physically harming the other child. And I want to show you what it looks like. The takeaway will be relatively easy here, even if the figure doesn't make so much sense. So what we're looking here is the mean change in interpersonal aggression from before versus after the intervention. What we'll see here is that negative scores mean that aggression decreased over time. Positive scores mean that aggression increased over time. So from before versus after the intervention, did we see an increase or a decrease in aggression? And they're also splitting it up by whether kids entered the study sort of showing high or low levels of aggression. So were these relatively aggressive kids at the beginning of the study or relatively unaggressive kids at the beginning of the study? And the finding they really emphasize in the article, and the finding that Godot and Sprafkin are taking issue with in their review, is that this is really the pattern that's played up in the results. And so what do we see here? The important thing is every score is negative. So what that means is that across all groups of children in this study, aggression was decreasing over time, particularly for kids who were starting high in initial aggression. So those kids who were entering the study kind of behaving more aggressively than others, we're seeing over the course of the study a decline in aggression. And that can maybe make sense. Over the course of this kind of structured summer program, regardless of what you are watching, you're sort of learning how to engage with other kids. You're in this structured setting. You're probably getting punished for engaging in aggressive behaviors. And so across all groups, we're seeing a decrease in aggression. The number that's really important here, though, is that for those who watched aggressive programming, so the Batman show, showed a very small decrease in aggression. So this is negative 0.019. In other words, basically zero. So they were really showing not much of a change in aggression over time. Whereas those who watched the neutral and the pro-social programs were showing a slightly larger mean change, so negative 0.123 and negative 0.088. So they were declining in aggression a bit more pronounced than those who watched the violent programs. But across the board, everybody sort of showing at least a slight decline, though the violent program is kind of pretty close to zero. So let me just summarize what I said there. Ignoring maybe the figure here, what they found is that there was no effect of media exposure on most types of aggression. Children who scored high in interpersonal aggression at the start of the study declined in their levels of aggression over time. And those who watched violent programming declined the least. So it wasn't the fact that watching the aggressive violent program was really increasing aggression. It was actually just showing really not much of an effect, and the other programs were actually decreasing aggressive outcomes over time. So I want to show you kind of the contrasting ways that these results are framed in these two articles. So in the early original piece that Friedrich and Stein published, they wrote, in the present study, aggressive programs influenced interpersonal aggression, but only for those children who were initially above the group average in aggression. But the important thing to note is that aggression still declined relative to baseline, and the comparison groups were just declining more. So what it suggests really is that maybe the pro-social and neutral programs are more effective at decreasing aggression, whereas the violent programs really aren't kind of moving kids one way or the other. And so Godot and Sprafkin, in their review of these kinds of field experiments, they argue that they're seeing a similar kind of pattern. And they're saying that they believe it's more important and a more scientifically valid criterion for the acceptance of this hypothesis of, violent media leading to aggression, that they shouldn't count or they should exclude studies in which the difference between the aggressive and comparison media, was really just because one improved behaviors rather than one worsening behaviors. In other words, what they're saying is that this particular study, for example, Friedrich and Stein, they were showing this effect of pro-social media decreasing aggression. They weren't really showing an effect of violent media increasing aggression. And they were saying if researchers want to make this argument that violent media is harmful to children, we really should be emphasizing results where aggression is shown to increase in response to these programs. And if we're not actually getting evidence of that, it's not really supporting the argument the way that it is often framed. So they're taking issue with the way these studies are often summarized and then used to support the argument. So the question then becomes, we have conflicting findings. In this body of research in particular, we have some lab experiments that have these highly controlled settings, kind of interesting measures of aggression, well-controlled manipulation checks, manipulating message features, stimulus sampling, all these things that can kind of help internal and external validity. So these lab experiments kind of suggesting there is an effect of media violence on aggression. But then we can also conduct field experiments that say something different, that maybe media violence leads to less aggression, maybe there's no effect on aggression, or maybe that pro-social media decreases aggression. And so the question for us becomes, when we've conducted a lot of studies on this topic using different methods and different types of media and different time periods in which we've collected them, what do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the internal validity that's often coming with lab experiments? Do we prioritize the external validity that's often coming with field experiments? Or do we try to kind of make sense of them both in a combined way? And particularly when we have these examples where there's no difference between conditions, what can we do to try and rule out alternative explanations for the results? What are some other ways that we can kind of strengthen the internal validity of these field experiments that might otherwise struggle with that aspect? So these are the kind of guiding questions I want to leave you with for this particular lecture. In person next week, we're going to start kind of trying to figure out what tools do we have as researchers to resolve some of these kind of conflicting results that we might get across different kinds of studies. And we'll be dealing with that for the next couple weeks. In terms of your reading for this week, you're actually going to read a really cool field study that was conducted on violent media and aggression. As you're reading this study, I want you to be thinking through what aspects of the study have the researchers kind of lost control of by kind of shifting this out into the field. In other words, what concerns do you have about the internal validity of this study? Another way of thinking about that is what alternative explanations can you think of that might explain the results that we're seeing in this study? So given that we're no longer confined to the lab, that we're actually conducting this study out in the fields, what sort of concerns do you have about how the independent variable was manipulated, how the dependent variable was measured, or how participants were randomized that might raise concerns about what they're finding in this study? And we'll talk about that next time in lecture. So this was intended to give you this introduction to field experiments, and we're starting to understand and think about, why the findings of lab and field experiments sometimes conflict, given these differences in what they tend to prioritize, some prioritizing internal validity, some prioritizing external validity. And now we're going to start thinking about how do we make sense of these potentially conflicting findings.